Clara Whitmore's hands trembled as the eastbound train shrieked into Covenant Station, carrying the husband she'd never met. A gentle schoolteacher whose letters promised safety, kindness, a future. But the man who stepped onto that windswept platform wore death like a second skin. A revolver hung low on his hip, his eyes carried the weight of violence, and when he spoke her name, his voice held no warmth. "I'm Elias Crow," he said. "The man you wrote to is dead." In that moment, Clara understood. She'd ordered a husband and received an armed stranger instead. What happens when your last hope arrives with a loaded gun? If you're watching from somewhere in this wide world, drop a comment with your city below. I want to see how far Clara's story travels. Hit that like button and settle in, because this tale is just beginning. The Wyoming wind tasted of dust and dying hope. Clara Whitmore stood alone on the platform of Covenant Station, watching the eastern horizon swallow the afternoon sun. Her fingers clutched a sheaf of letters. 14 months of correspondence, each one a lifeline thrown across 1,000 miles of emptiness. The paper had grown soft from handling. The ink faded in places where her thumb had traced over promises written in careful, educated script. "I will be a good husband to you, Clara. I will honor your land and your independence. I ask only for partnership, companionship, and the chance to build something honest in a place where honesty still matters." Those words had been signed by a man named Thomas Merritt, a school teacher from Philadelphia seeking a fresh start, a woman to share it with, a life uncomplicated by the violence and corruption that had driven him west. His letters spoke of poetry, of philosophy, of quiet evenings and mutual respect. He'd sent a photograph, a slender man with kind eyes and soft hands that had never held anything heavier than a book. Clara had written back because she had no choice. The homestead her father built sat 3 miles north of town, 160 acres of stubborn earth that refused to yield without a fight. 6 months ago, her father's heart had simply stopped while he stood in the barn, a hammer still gripped in his hand. The bank held the note. The neighbors watched with sympathetic eyes and predatory patience. A woman alone couldn't hold land. Not here, not in a territory where law bent toward men and money. So she'd answered an advertisement in the matrimonial news, written to a stranger, and made a bargain that tasted like surrender. Now the train was here. The locomotive screamed as it ground to a halt, brakes shrieking metal against metal. Steam hissed into the cold air. Clara's breath came short and shallow. She smoothed her dress, the good blue cotton she'd worn to her father's funeral, and tried to steady herself. The passenger door opened, and the wrong man stepped out. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders broad enough to fill a doorway and a build that spoke of hard labor and harder living. Dark hair fell across his forehead, too long, unkempt. His face was all sharp angles, high cheekbones, a jaw like chiseled stone, a mouth set in a grim line that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. But it was his eyes that stopped Clara's heart, pale gray, cold as winter sky, and haunted by something that made her instinctively step back. A revolver sat holstered at his right hip. Not hidden, not apologetic, just there, as natural as breathing. He carried a single worn canvas bag and wore trail dust like a second coat. When his gaze found her across the platform, something flickered in those gray eyes. Recognition, maybe regret. But it vanished before Clara could name it. He walked toward her with the measured stride of a man accustomed to violence. "Clara Whitmore?" His voice was rough, low, scraped raw by wind and distance. She couldn't speak. Her throat had closed around the words. He stopped 3 paces away, close enough to speak privately, far enough to avoid impropriety. His eyes moved over her face with an intensity that felt invasive, assessing. Then he looked past her, scanning the empty platform, the darkening street beyond, the roof lines of the small buildings that comprised Covenant's commercial district, always watching, always measuring threats. "My name is Elias Crow." He said it quietly, with a finality that felt like a door closing. "The man you've been writing to, Thomas Merritt, he's dead." The world tilted. Clara heard the words but couldn't process them. Her vision narrowed to pinpoints. The letters in her hand suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. Dead? Fever took him 6 weeks ago, in Kansas. Elias spoke without inflection, delivering facts with the detachment of a man who'd seen too much death to dress it up with sentiment. "He was my friend. Before he died, he asked me to come here in his place, to honor the commitment he made to you. Your friend. Claire repeated the words stupidly, trying to make sense of them. You're not Thomas. No, ma'am. Then why are you here? Elias's jaw tightened. For a moment he didn't answer, just stood there with the wind pulling at his coat and something dark moving behind his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice carried an edge of something that might have been pain. Because I made a promise to a dying man, and because you need help whether you know it or not. Anger flared hot in Clara's chest, burning through the shock. You don't know anything about what I need. I know you're alone on a homestead with a banknote coming due. I know your neighbors are waiting for you to fail so they can pick over what's left. I know that come spring, if you're still unmarried, the land office will find a reason to invalidate your claim. His voice remained flat, factual, devastating. Thomas told me everything. He wanted to protect you. That's what I'm here to do. By pretending to be him? By being what he would have been. A husband on paper. Someone who can put his name on a deed and keep the wolves at bay. Clara laughed, a bitter sound that hurt her throat. You're a stranger with a gun. That's supposed to comfort me? Elias's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his stance, a slight relaxation, as if he'd expected exactly this response and found it reasonable. No, he said quietly. It's not. But it's what I can offer, and it's more than you'll have if I get back on that train. The truth of it hit Clara like a fist to the stomach. She looked at this hard, dangerous man, this armed stranger who'd appeared in place of the gentle schoolteacher she'd imagined, and understood with crushing clarity that he was right. The homestead would fail without a man's name attached to it. The bank would foreclose. Her father's legacy would disappear into someone else's profit margin. And she would have nothing. Thomas Merritt's letters had promised salvation. Elias Crow promised only survival. What exactly are you proposing? Clara forced the words past the tightness in her chest. A legal marriage. In name only. Elias spoke with the precision of a man negotiating a contract. I'll work the land, handle the bank, deal with anyone who threatens you or your property. You'll have full authority over the house and your own life. I won't ask for anything beyond what's necessary to maintain the appearance of a legitimate union. And when you decide to leave? Then I'll leave. He met her eyes directly, unflinching. But not until your position is secure. Not until you can stand on your own without legal challenges. Clara studied him. This stranger with a killer's eyes and a dead man's obligation. Everything about him screamed danger, the gun, the watchfulness, the way he stood like a man expecting attack from any direction. But beneath the hardness, she saw something else. Exhaustion. A bone-deep weariness that went beyond physical fatigue. And in the careful distance he maintained, in the formality of his speech, she recognized something that Thomas's letters had promised. Respect. Brutal, uncomfortable respect. But respect nonetheless. If I say no? Clara asked. Then I'll wish you luck and be gone. He would too. She could see it in his face. He hadn't come to force her hand, to take advantage of her desperation. He'd come because a dying man had asked him to, and he would honor that request exactly as far as she allowed, no further. Clara looked down at the letters in her hand, Thomas Merritt's gentle words, his promises of partnership in quiet evenings. Then she looked at the man standing before her, hard and armed and utterly unlike anything she'd imagined. The sun had nearly disappeared now. In another hour, full dark would settle over the territory, and she would still be alone, still vulnerable, still standing on the edge of losing everything. There are conditions, Clara said, hearing her own voice from a great distance. Elias nodded once. Name them. You sleep in the barn. You don't enter the house unless I invite you. You don't touch me. You don't make demands on my time, my labor, or... She swallowed hard. Or anything else. Agreed. I keep the household accounts. I make decisions about the house, the garden, the livestock. Agreed. And if I tell you to leave, for any reason, you go. No argument, no delay. For the first time, something almost like warmth touched Elias's expression. a faint, grim smile that lasted less than a heartbeat. "Fair enough," he said. "Do we have an arrangement?" Clara wanted to scream, wanted to cry, wanted to run back to the homestead and barricade herself inside until this nightmare resolved itself into something comprehensible. Instead, she straightened her spine and met his gaze. "We need to see the pastor. Tonight, if possible. I want this done legally, with witnesses and documentation." "Smart." Elias picked up his bag. "Lead the way." Pastor John Henriksen lived behind the white-clapboard church at the east end of Covenant's main street. He answered Clara's knock with a coffee cup in one hand and suspicion in his eyes, suspicion that deepened when he saw the armed stranger standing beside her. "Clara?" The pastor was a solid man in his 50s, Swedish by birth, with a thick accent and a gentle manner that had comforted her through her father's death. "What's this about?" "I need you to perform a marriage, Pastor. Right now." Henriksen's gaze moved from Clara to Elias and back again, concern etching lines around his mouth. "This is very sudden." "I sent for a husband," Clara said, forcing her voice steady. "He's here. The arrangement was always quick. You knew that." "Yes, but—" The pastor hesitated, clearly choosing his words with care. "Clara, I must ask if you're entering this freely. If there's any coercion or—" "There isn't." Clara cut him off. "I know what I'm doing." Elias remained silent throughout the exchange, standing slightly behind Clara with his face carefully neutral. But his presence filled the doorway like a physical weight, and Clara saw the pastor's eyes drift repeatedly to the revolver at his hip. "Perhaps we should speak privately," Henriksen suggested, "just for a moment." Clara almost laughed. The pastor thought he was protecting her, thought this armed stranger might be forcing her hand. He didn't understand that the real threat wasn't the man beside her. It was the banknote, the land office, the slow starvation of being a woman alone in a territory built for men. "Pastor, please," she said quietly. "I need this done tonight. I need it legal and documented. Can you help me or not?" Something in her voice must have convinced him. Henriksen sighed heavily, then nodded and stepped back to let them enter. "I'll need witnesses," he said, "and I'll need to know your full names." "Clara Ann Whitmore. Elias John Crow." The pastor fetched his wife, a kind-faced woman named Ingrid, who took one look at Clara's face and asked no questions, and his ledger book. They assembled in the small parlor where lamplight pushed back the darkness and the smell of strong coffee hung in the air. Henriksen opened a worn Bible, found his place, and began to speak. The words washed over Clara like cold water. Love, honor, cherish. For better or worse, sickness and health, until death. She heard herself repeating vows in a voice that didn't sound like her own, watched Elias do the same with mechanical precision, felt Ingrid slip a simple gold band borrowed from the pastor's wife onto her finger. At no point did Elias look at her with anything resembling affection or desire. His gaze remained fixed somewhere past her shoulder, his expression carved from stone. When Henriksen pronounced them married, neither moved to kiss. The moment simply ended, leaving them standing side by side as strangers who now shared a legal bond. "You'll need to sign the certificate," the pastor said, pushing the ledger forward. Clara signed first, her hand surprisingly steady. Then Elias took the pen and added his name in a sharp, controlled script that suggested education beneath the rough exterior. Henriksen and Ingrid witnessed. The pastor pressed his seal into wax. Just like that, Clara Whitmore became Clara Crow. "I'll file this with the county tomorrow," Henriksen said, closing the book with a soft thud. He looked at Clara with obvious concern. "You're sure about this?" "I'm sure." He didn't look convinced, but he nodded. "Then God bless you both. You're welcome in our home anytime, either of you." Outside, the night had turned sharp and cold. Clara pulled her shawl tighter and started walking toward the livery where she'd left her wagon. Elias followed in silence, his boots loud on the frozen dirt. The livery owner, a taciturn man named Sam, barely glanced up when Clara paid for the day's boarding. But when Elias lifted his bag into the wagon bed, Sam's eyes went hard and knowing. Word would spread fast. By tomorrow, everyone in Covenant would know Clara had married a stranger, a dangerous stranger. Let them talk. Clara climbed onto the wagon bench and took up the reins. Elias settled beside her, careful to maintain space between them despite the narrow seat. The homestead is 3 miles north, Clara said. We should arrive within the hour. I'll handle the driving if you want. I've been handling it for 6 months. I can manage. Elias said nothing to that, just settled back and let her drive. The road stretched ahead, barely visible in the starlight. The horses knew the way. Clara focused on the rhythm of hooves, the creak of wheels, anything but the armed stranger now legally bound to her. Husband. The word felt like a foreign object in her mouth. After a long silence, Elias spoke. Your father built the homestead? Yes. 5 years ago, after my mother died, he wanted a fresh start. What happened to him? His heart gave out. One morning, he just... Clara stopped, swallowing hard. It was fast. I'm sorry. The words were simple, but something in his tone made Clara glance sideways. In the faint light, Elias's profile was all hard edges, but his eyes had softened fractionally, just enough to remind her that he was human beneath the armor. Thomas told you about my father? Clara asked. He told me you'd suffered loss, that you needed stability, not romance, that you deserved someone who could be a partner without demanding more than you wanted to give. Elias paused. He thought he could be that for you. When he realized he couldn't, when he knew he was dying, he asked me to try. Why did you agree? Elias took his time answering. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that Clara felt in her chest. Because Thomas was a good man, and good men are rare. Because he believed you deserved protection, even from beyond the grave. And because he stopped, jaw working. Because I owed him a debt I could never repay except by honoring his last wish. What debt? That's my business, Mrs. Crow. The formality stung, but Clara understood it. Distance. Boundaries. The terms of their arrangement. They rode the rest of the way in silence. The homestead appeared as a dark silhouette against darker sky, a modest 2-room house with a barn, chicken coop, and split-rail fence that enclosed a winter-dead garden. Clara felt a familiar ache as they approached. This place was all she had left of her father, all that remained of the life they'd tried to build. And now a stranger would live here, work this land, sleep in that barn. Clara pulled the wagon to a stop near the house and set the brake. Elias climbed down, grabbed his bag, and waited while she unhitched the horses. I'll take care of them, he said. I can... Mrs. Crow. He cut her off gently but firmly. I'll take care of the horses. You should go inside, get some rest. We can talk in the morning about what needs doing. Clara wanted to argue, to maintain control over every small task, but exhaustion crashed over her suddenly. Not just physical weariness, but the crushing weight of everything that had happened in the space of 2 hours. She'd expected a gentle schoolteacher. She'd gotten a gunman. She'd married him anyway. The barn is clean, Clara said quietly. There's hay in the loft and blankets in the tack room. If you need anything, I'll be fine. Elias took the horse's leads. Thank you. Clara nodded and turned toward the house, feeling his eyes on her back as she walked away. At the door, she paused and looked back. Elias stood in the yard, a dark figure against the darker night, the horses calm beside him. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched her with those pale, haunted eyes. Clara went inside and locked the door. The house felt unbearably empty. She lit a lamp, set water to heat on the stove, and sank into her father's chair, the one piece of furniture he'd insisted on bringing from their old life in Missouri. The wood was worn smooth by years of use, shaped to fit a body that no longer existed. Clara put her face in her hands and tried not to cry. Outside, she heard Elias moving around the barn, quiet, efficient sounds of a man settling in for the night. The horses whinnied softly. A door creaked closed, then silence. Clara sat in that silence for a long time, holding the marriage certificate the pastor had given her, reading the names over and over. Clara Ann Crow and Elias John Crow, joined in holy matrimony this 23rd day of November, 1886. Her husband was a stranger with a gun. Her marriage was a business arrangement. Her future was utterly uncertain. Clara set the certificate aside, banked the fire, and went to bed still wearing her good blue dress because she was too tired to change. She lay in the darkness, listening to nothing, feeling the weight of the ring on her finger, a borrowed band that represented a borrowed life. Tomorrow she would face whatever came next. Tonight, she just needed to survive until morning. Clara woke to the smell of coffee. For one disoriented moment, she thought her father was alive, that the past 6 months had been a nightmare, and she would walk into the kitchen to find him stoking the stove, humming off key the way he always did before dawn. Then memory returned. The train, Elias, the wedding, the stranger in her barn. Clara dressed quickly, braided her hair, and emerged from the bedroom to find the kitchen stove burning and a pot of coffee sitting on the heat. Through the window, she could see Elias in the yard, already working, inspecting the fence line, checking the barn roof, moving with the focused efficiency of a man accustomed to making quick assessments. He'd been up for hours, clearly. Clara poured herself coffee and stood at the window, watching him work. In the morning light, he looked less like a gunfighter and more like what he claimed to be, a man honoring a friend's request. His coat was off despite the cold. His shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows. He moved with an economy of motion that suggested experience with hard labor, but the gun remained at his hip, always there, always present. Clara finished her coffee, pulled on her father's old work coat, and went outside. Elias heard her approach and turned, waiting as she crossed the yard. In the clear morning light, she could see details she'd missed the night before. A scar that cut through his left eyebrow, calluses on his hands thick as leather, a faint hollowness to his cheeks that suggested recent weight loss or long hunger. "Morning," he said simply. "Morning. Thank you for making coffee." Seemed like the least I could do. He gestured toward the fence line. "Your south pasture needs work. Rails are rotting through in 3 places. If we get heavy snow, you'll lose containment." "I know. I haven't had time to fix it." "I'll handle it today if you have spare lumber." Clara hesitated. "I don't have money to pay you for supplies." "I'm not asking for payment, Mrs. Crow. I'm doing what needs doing." The formality again. Mrs. Crow, never Clara, always maintaining distance. "There's lumber in the barn," Clara said. "My father bought it before he died. I just haven't been strong enough to—" She stopped, hating the admission of weakness. Elias nodded without comment. "I'll get started. You need anything from town today?" "Not today." "Then I'll be working close by. If you need me, just call." He turned and walked toward the barn without waiting for dismissal, leaving Clara standing in the yard with cold air burning her lungs and questions piling up in her throat. She wanted to ask about his past, about the violence that lived in his eyes, about what kind of debt could drive a man to marry a stranger. But fear held her tongue, not fear of Elias. She'd already made that bargain, already accepted the risk, fear of what the answers might reveal. Elias worked through the morning with single-minded focus. Clara watched from the kitchen window as he tore down rotting fence rails and fitted new lumber with the precision of a man who'd done this work before. He didn't waste motion, didn't stop for rest. When the sun climbed toward noon, he paused only long enough to drink water from the well, then returned to his task. Clara made bread and soup, simple food, but filling. At midday, she carried a bowl out to the yard, finding Elias waist-deep in the work, sweat darkening his shirt despite the cold. "You should eat," Clara said. Elias straightened, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. His eyes went immediately to the bowl she carried, then to her face, reading the gesture for any hidden meaning. "That's kind of you," he said carefully. "It's practical. A hungry man can't work efficiently." A faint smile touched his mouth. So brief Clara almost missed it. "Fair point." He took the bowl, but didn't sit, just stood there eating with the kind of focus that suggested hunger had been a companion for too long. Clara noticed the way his hand shook slightly, exhaustion or something else she couldn't tell. "How long since you slept properly?" Clara asked before she could stop herself. Elias paused mid-bite, considering the question. "While. You don't have to work yourself to death in one day." "I'm not." He finished the soup and handed back the bowl. "Just making up for lost time." "Lost time?" But Elias had already turned back to the fence, the conversation clearly over. Clara returned to the house, frustration simmering beneath her ribs. The man was an enigma, polite but distant, hardworking but secretive, careful to maintain boundaries while living inside the fence line of her life. She wanted to trust him. She was terrified to try. What? By evening, Elias had replaced all the damaged fence rails, rehung the barn door that had been sagging for months, and reinforced the chicken coop against predators. He worked until full dark, then washed at the well and retreated to the barn without seeking conversation or approval. Clara stood at her kitchen window and watched him disappear into the shadows, wondering what kind of man kept such rigid control over himself, what kind of past required that level of discipline. The revolver he wore wasn't just a tool, it was a warning. Clara locked the door, banked the fire, and went to bed for the second night with a stranger sleeping 50 yards away, a stranger who was now legally her husband, who had spent the day rebuilding her property with quiet competence, who remained as unreachable as smoke. She lay in the darkness and thought about Thomas Merritt's letters, about the gentle life they'd promised, about the cruel joke fate had played by sending Elias Crow instead. Then she thought about the fence that would now hold through winter, about the barn door that no longer hung crooked, about the coffee that waited each morning. Small things, practical things, the kind of things a partner did. Clara turned over and closed her eyes, trying to silence the voice in her head that whispered a dangerous question. What if this arrangement becomes something more? Because that way lay heartbreak, and Clara had already lost enough. The first snow came 3 weeks after the wedding, falling soft and silent through a gray dawn that turned the world into something unrecognizable. Clara woke to find the homestead blanketed in white, every familiar landmark transformed into gentle curves and strange shadows. She stood at the window with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, watching Elias emerge from the barn already dressed for work, his breath fogging in the cold air. He'd settled into a rhythm over those 3 weeks, a careful, disciplined routine that kept him visible but separate. Every morning before sunrise, he tended the animals. Every evening after dark, he repaired something Clara hadn't realized was broken. He spoke only when necessary, ate the meals she left on the porch without comment, and maintained the boundaries they'd established with almost religious devotion. But Clara had begun to notice things. The way he positioned himself between her and the road whenever a rider passed. The way his hand drifted toward his gun when unexpected sounds carried from the tree line. The way he watched the horizon like a man expecting demons to emerge from thin air. Whatever violence lived in Elias Crow's past, it hadn't released him yet. Clara set down her cup and pulled on her father's coat, wrapping a scarf around her throat before stepping outside. The cold bit through her layers immediately, sharp enough to steal breath. Her boots crunched through virgin snow as she crossed toward the barn where Elias was hauling water for the horses. "Storm's moving in," she called out. "Radio says it might last 2 days." Elias straightened, scanning the sky with the practiced eye of someone who'd survived bad weather in bad places. "We'll need more firewood in the house, and you should check your food stores." "I have enough put by. What about you?" He looked at her then, really looked, and Clara saw something flicker across his face, surprise maybe, that she'd thought to ask. "I'll manage," he said. "The barn's going to be miserable if the temperature drops like they're predicting." Clara spoke before caution could silence her. "There's a room off the kitchen. My father used it for storage, but it has a stove. You could sleep there during the storm." Elias went very still. "That wasn't our arrangement." "The arrangement was you sleep in the barn. It didn't account for blizzard conditions." Clara kept her voice practical, businesslike. "I'm not inviting you into my bedroom, Mr. Crow. I'm offering you a warm place to sleep so you don't freeze to death 50 yards from the house." For a long moment, he didn't respond. Then he nodded once, sharp and decisive. "Appreciated. I'll bring my things in before the storm hits." Clara returned to the house feeling oddly unsettled. She'd meant the offer practically, losing her only help to hypothermia would be catastrophic, but something about crossing that boundary made her nervous. The barn had been a physical manifestation of distance. Bringing Elias into the house, even just the storage room, felt dangerous in ways she couldn't articulate. She spent the morning checking supplies and reinforcing the chicken coop, watching the sky grow heavier with each passing hour. By noon, the snow was falling in earnest, thick, wet flakes that obscured the tree line and turned the air white. Elias worked alongside her without speaking, moving with efficient urgency to secure everything that could blow loose or get buried. When he finally brought his bag to the storage room, Clara was surprised by how little he owned. One change of clothes, a whetstone and cleaning kit for the revolver, a small leather-bound book that looked like a journal, a photograph so worn she couldn't make out the faces. "I cleared the table in there," Clara said, keeping her voice neutral. "And there's a lock on the door if you want privacy." "Won't need it." Elias set his bag down and looked around the small space. Bare walls, a narrow cot, a potbelly stove that hadn't been used in months. "This is more than adequate, thank you. I'll have supper ready around 6. I can eat in here, Mr. Crow." Clara stopped him before he could retreat. "If we're going to live under the same roof, even temporarily, we should at least share a table. I'm not asking for conversation, just civility." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the armor so brief she almost missed it. "All right." The storm hit in full force around 4 in the afternoon, wind screaming across the plains and driving snow horizontal. Clara lit lamps against the early darkness and made a simple stew from salt pork and root vegetables, trying not to think about the armed stranger now occupying her father's storage room. When she called Elias for supper, he emerged clean-shaven and wearing a fresh shirt, his hair still damp from washing. Without the trail dust and exhaustion, he looked younger, maybe 35, though the hardness around his eyes suggested he'd lived more than his years. They sat across from each other at the small kitchen table, the silence broken only by the wind battering the house and the quiet sounds of eating. Clara watched Elias from beneath her lashes, noticing the way he sat with his back to the wall, the way his eyes tracked every sound, the way he ate with controlled precision as if meals were tactical exercises rather than comfort. "How long were you friends with Thomas?" Clara asked finally, unable to bear the silence any longer. Elias finished chewing before answering. 4 years, give or take. We met in Kansas City." "What were you doing in Kansas City? Trying to become someone else?" He said it without inflection, as if discussing the weather. Clara set down her spoon. "And Thomas helped you?" Thomas believed people could change, that past mistakes didn't have to define future possibilities. Elias met her eyes across the table. He was wrong, mostly. But he believed it anyway. "You don't think people can change?" "I think some stains go too deep to wash out." The bleakness in his voice made Clara's chest ache. She wanted to ask what stains he carried, what he'd done that carved such darkness into a man's soul. But fear held her tongue. Fear that knowing would make everything worse, would transform Elias from enigma to monster. "Thomas's letters were kind," Clara said instead. "He made me feel like I wasn't just a transaction. You weren't. He cared about you even though you'd never met. He read your letters over and over, trying to understand who you were, what you needed." Elias paused, something complicated moving across his face. "He wanted to be worthy of you. And you don't?" "I'm not here to be worthy, Mrs. Crow. I'm here to keep you safe. There's a difference." Clara wanted to argue, to push past the walls he'd built so carefully around himself, but exhaustion and the storm's intensity made everything feel fragile, provisional. "Why do you carry the gun?" she asked quietly. Elias's hand moved unconsciously to the revolver at his hip. "Because there are men who'd kill me if they knew where to find me, and because I'm better armed than sorry." "What did you do?" "Things I can't undo." He stood abruptly, carrying his bowl to the wash basin. "Thank you for the meal. I'll clean up." "Mr. Crow." "Please." He didn't turn around. "I appreciate your hospitality, but there are things you're better off not knowing." Clara recognized dismissal when she heard it. She rose from the table and retreated to her bedroom, closing the door on whatever demons haunted the man she'd married. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, 2 strangers tried to occupy the same space without touching. The night stretched long and sleepless. Clara lay in bed listening to the wind shriek and the house creak under the assault, acutely aware of Elias just beyond her wall. She heard him moving occasionally, restless sounds that suggested sleep eluded him too. Once, she heard him open the back door, felt the temperature drop as freezing air rushed in, then heard it close again. Checking the perimeter even in blizzard conditions. Always vigilant, always watching. Morning came gray and bitter, the storm showing no signs of weakening. Clara found Elias already awake, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, staring out at the white void. "Roads will be impassable," he said without preamble. "Could be days before anyone can get through." "I know." Clara moved to the stove, grateful for something to occupy her hands. "We have enough supplies. We'll manage." "You've done this before? Been snowed in alone?" "Last winter, for nearly a week." The memory still carried an edge of terror. The crushing silence, the fear that her father's body wouldn't be found until spring thaw, the desperate loneliness that had driven her to write to the matrimonial news in the first place. Elias turned to look at her, reading something in her face that made his expression soften fractionally. "You won't be alone this time." The simple statement shouldn't have mattered as much as it did. They fell into an uneasy routine as the storm continued. Clara cooked and managed the house. Elias tended the animals multiple times a day, fighting through waist-deep drifts to ensure nothing froze or starved. They shared meals in careful silence, each retreat to neutral corners afterward, circling each other like wary dogs establishing territory. But on the second night, something shifted. Clara woke to the sound of shouting, harsh, desperate sounds coming from the storage room. She grabbed her father's hunting rifle and crept into the kitchen, heart hammering, before recognizing the tone of the cries. Not attack. Nightmare. She stood frozen outside Elias's door, listening to him fight invisible demons in his sleep. The sounds were raw, broken. Words she couldn't make out mixed with denials and pleas. Then silence, followed by harsh breathing. Clara knocked softly. "Mr. Crow?" Movement inside. Then Elias's voice, rough with sleep and something darker. "I'm fine. Go back to bed." "You don't sound fine." "Mrs. Crow." A pause, then quieter. "Please, just go." Clara pressed her hand against the door, feeling the cold wood beneath her palm, wanting to help and having no idea how. Finally, she retreated to her room and lay awake until dawn, thinking about the violence men carried inside themselves, about the wars that continued long after battlefields went quiet. In the morning, Elias appeared at breakfast with shadows under his eyes and fresh tension in his shoulders. He didn't mention the nightmares. Clara didn't ask. They ate in silence while the storm finally began to ease, wind dying to a whisper, snow tapering to occasional flurries. "Should clear by afternoon," Elias said, pushing away from the table. "I'll start digging out." "You need rest." "I need to work." He said it with finality, then paused at the door. "Thank you for leaving it alone." Clara nodded, understanding what he couldn't say. "Thank you for not forcing me to explain the horrors I carry." The storm broke completely by evening, leaving the homestead buried under 3 feet of pristine snow that reflected moonlight like crushed diamonds. Clara stood on the porch, watching Elias shovel paths to the barn and coop, his breath fogging in the crystal air, his movements mechanical and tireless. He'd been working for hours without break. She filled a thermos with hot coffee and carried it outside, her boots squeaking in the fresh snow. Elias heard her approach and straightened, leaning on the shovel. "You'll hurt yourself," Clara said, offering the thermos. "I'm all right." "You haven't slept properly in 2 days. You're running on nothing." She pushed the thermos toward him. "Take a break. The work will still be here in 20 minutes. Elias accepted the coffee with obvious reluctance, as if kindness made him uncomfortable. He drank in silence, eyes scanning the white landscape with habitual wariness. "What are you looking for?" Clara asked. "Tracks. Signs someone passed while we were snowed in." "Who would be out in that storm?" "Men who don't care about weather when they care about revenge." He said it matter-of-factly, then seemed to realize he'd revealed too much. "Old habits. Someone's hunting you." It wasn't a question. Elias's jaw tightened, but he didn't deny it. "How long have you been running?" Clara pressed. "Long enough to know how to recognize a tail. Long enough to get good at disappearing." He handed back the thermos. "I'll move on when the road's clear. Give you back your storage room." "I didn't ask you to leave." "You should." Elias met her eyes directly, and Clara saw genuine regret there. Maybe the first unguarded emotion he'd shown her. "I brought danger to your doorstep, Mrs. Crow. The kind that doesn't care about bystanders." "Then why come here at all? Why not just run?" "Because I made a promise to a dying man." His voice hardened. And because I hoped maybe this corner of nowhere was remote enough that ghosts couldn't find me. Clara studied his face, the exhaustion, the fear he tried to hide, the bone-deep weariness of a man who'd been hunted too long. "How bad are these ghosts?" she asked. "Bad enough that you don't want details." "I'm not asking for details. I'm asking if we need to be prepared." Elias hesitated, clearly weighing how much to tell her. "There's a man named Jack Cutter. He ran a criminal operation in Kansas City. Robbery, extortion, worse. Thomas and I both worked for him once, before we knew better. When we tried to leave, Cutter made examples of people. Thomas got away clean because he was smart about covering his tracks. I wasn't as careful." "What did you do?" "I testified against him in federal court, put him in prison for 15 years. Elias's voice went flat. "He got out 6 months ago, been hunting everyone who turned on him ever since." The words fell between them like stones into deep water. Clara processed the implications slowly. "You put a criminal away. That's a good thing." "I also got 3 people killed because Cutter found them before the marshals could protect them. Thomas would have been the 4th if Fever hadn't taken him first." Elias's hands tightened on the shovel. "So no, Mrs. Crow. I'm not a good man doing good things. I'm a survivor who's killed everyone stupid enough to trust me." "That's not... It's exactly true." He cut her off. "And you need to understand that before you decide whether to tell me to leave or let me stay." Clara looked at this hard, haunted man who'd appeared in place of her gentle schoolteacher, who'd worked himself ragged maintaining her property, who fought demons in his sleep and watched the horizon for death. She thought about Thomas Merritt's final wish, about the promise Elias carried like a cross, about the difference between running from danger and standing despite it. "The storage room is yours as long as you need it," Clara said quietly. Elias stared at her. "You're not afraid?" "I'm terrified. But you've been here 3 weeks, and the worst thing you've done is fix my fence." She pulled her coat tighter against the cold. "If this Cutter is really hunting you, running won't change that. Maybe it's time to stop." "And do what? Wait for him to show up and kill everyone in range? Or prepare. Fight if necessary." Clara surprised herself with the steadiness in her voice. "I'm not helpless, Mr. Crow. I've survived alone for 6 months. I can load a rifle and shoot straight. If trouble comes, I'd rather face it standing than spend the rest of my life wondering when the axe will fall." For a long moment, Elias didn't speak. Then something shifted in his expression, surprise giving way to reluctant respect. "You understand what you're saying, what you might be signing up for. I understand that hiding didn't save my father from death, that pretending everything's safe doesn't make it true." Clara met his eyes without flinching. "I'd rather know the truth and prepare than live blind." Elias nodded slowly. "All right then, but we do this smart. I teach you how to recognize danger, how to defend yourself properly, how to survive if things go sideways. And if Cutter does show up..." He paused, jaw working. "If he shows up, you run. You don't fight, you don't play hero. You get on a horse and ride for town and let me handle it. That's the deal, Mrs. Crow. Take it or tell me to pack my bag." Clara wanted to argue, to insist she wouldn't abandon him to face danger alone. But she recognized the look in his eyes, the absolute refusal to negotiate this particular point. "Fine," she said. "But you teach me everything. No holding back because you think I'm too fragile." "I don't think you're fragile." Elias almost smiled. "Stubborn, maybe. Braver than sense, but not fragile." The almost compliment warmed something in Clara's chest that she'd thought frozen solid. They stood in the snow-bright darkness, 2 people bound by circumstance and choice, and Clara felt the nature of their arrangement shift slightly, from transaction to something that might eventually become partnership. "Come inside," she said finally. "You can finish shoveling tomorrow. Tonight you need rest." Elias looked like he might argue, then simply nodded and followed her into the house. Over the next week, as the snow slowly melted and roads became passable again, Elias made good on his promise. He taught Clara how to shoot the rifle with real accuracy, how to listen for the sounds that meant trouble, how to position herself for maximum advantage in a fight. He showed her where to hide emergency supplies, how to read tracks in snow and mud, how to move quietly when silence meant survival. Clara proved an apt student. Her father had taught her the basics, but Elias taught her to think like someone hunted, to anticipate violence before it arrived. He was patient and thorough, never condescending, treating her like a partner rather than a liability. And slowly, carefully, they began to talk. Not about deep things, Elias still kept his worst memories locked away, but about small details. Clara learned he'd grown up in Tennessee, orphaned young, drifted west looking for purpose. He learned she'd wanted to be a teacher before her mother died, that she loved poetry but never shared it, that she dreamed of expanding the homestead into something that could support more than just survival. They discovered they both preferred coffee black, both hated waste, both valued silence more than empty conversation. The boundaries remained: separate rooms, formal address, careful distance, but something underneath was shifting, warming, becoming less like armor and more like choice. Then one morning, Clara walked outside to find Elias standing rigid in the yard, staring at something in the dirt near the barn. "What is it?" she called. He didn't answer, just gestured for her to come look. Clara crossed the yard and looked down at what had caught his attention. Tracks in the half-melted snow. Boot prints too large to be Elias's, too fresh to be old. They circled the barn, approached the house, then retreated back toward the tree line. Someone had been here. Recently. While they slept. Elias's hand rested on his revolver, his face carved from stone. "Get inside, lock the doors, don't open them for anyone but me." Elias, now Clara. He used her first name for the first time, and the urgency in his voice killed any argument. "Please." Clara ran for the house, heart hammering. Behind her, she heard Elias moving toward the tree line, following tracks that led toward whatever waited in the shadows. She locked the door and grabbed the rifle, positioning herself where she could see both approaches to the house. Outside, Elias disappeared into the trees. Minutes stretched like hours. Clara's hands shook on the rifle, her breath coming fast and shallow. She thought about everything Elias had taught her, about staying calm under pressure, about not firing unless she had a clear target. A gunshot cracked through the morning air, then another, then silence so complete it felt like death. Clara's finger trembled on the trigger, every muscle screaming at her to run outside, to help, to do something other than wait. Then Elias emerged from the trees, walking slowly, deliberately. Blood stained his shirt, but he was upright, alive. Clara threw open the door and ran to meet him. "Are you hurt?" She reached for him without thinking, hands moving over his chest, his arms searching for wounds. "Not my blood." Elias caught her hands gently, stopping their frantic movement. "Clara, I'm all right. What happened? Who was it?" "Scout, one of Cutter's men, checking to see if I was here." Elias's voice was flat, emotionless. "He won't be reporting back." The implication hung in the air between them. Clara had known violence existed in Elias's past. Now she understood it lived in his present too, lived in his hands, in the cold efficiency with which he'd eliminated a threat. She should have been horrified. Instead, she felt a strange, fierce gratitude that he'd stood between her and danger. "How long before more come?" Clara asked. "Days? Maybe a week." Elias released her hands and stepped back, distance reasserting itself. "Cutter's patient. He'll wait for confirmation before sending a larger crew. Then we prepare. Then you leave." Elias's jaw set. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. I brought death to your doorstep, Clara. I won't let it take you too." "You don't get to make that choice for me." "The hell I don't. I'm your husband." "On paper." Clara's voice rose, anger and fear mixing into something combustible. "You're my husband on paper, Elias Crow, which gives you exactly zero rights to dictate my life. This is my land, my home, and I'm not running from it." They stood toe-to-toe in the yard, breathing hard, the morning sun bright and cold around them. "If you stay, you could die," Elias said quietly. "If I run, I lose everything I have left." Bishop Clara held his gaze. "I won't do that, not again, not even for you." Something cracked in Elias's expression, the armor finally giving way to reveal the man beneath. He looked young, suddenly, vulnerable, terrified in ways that had nothing to do with his own survival. "I can't lose anyone else," he whispered. "Clara, I can't." She understood then. The nightmares, the rigid control, the desperate need to keep distance. Elias Crow wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of caring enough that death would matter. Clara reached up and touched his face. The first time she'd deliberately made contact, feeling the rough stubble, the sharp line of his jaw, the heat of his skin. "Then we fight together," she said, "and we survive together. No more running." Elias closed his eyes, leaning into her touch for just a moment before pulling away. "All right," he said roughly. "Together, but we do this smart." Agreed. They stood in the morning light, covered in another man's blood, and made a pact that would either save them or doom them both. The war was coming, but this time they would be ready. They buried the scout's body in the frozen ground beyond the tree line, working in grim silence as the sun climbed higher. Elias handled the digging with mechanical efficiency while Clara kept watch, the rifle heavy in her hands and her eyes scanning the horizon for movement that never came. When the grave was filled and disguised with deadfall and snow, Elias stood for a moment staring at the disturbed earth, his face unreadable. "First time you've seen me kill a man," he said without looking at her. "Yes." "Changed how you see me?" Clara considered the question honestly. The violence should have terrified her, should have confirmed every fear about the armed stranger she'd married. Instead, she felt only a cold clarity about what survival required in a territory where law was a distant concept and justice belonged to whoever could claim it. "You protected us," she said. "That's what I see." Elias turned to look at her then, something raw and uncertain in his eyes. "Most people would call me a murderer. Most people haven't lived alone on a homestead where help is 3 miles away and the bank would rather see you fail than succeed." Clara shifted the rifle to her other shoulder. "I'm not most people, Elias." He nodded slowly, accepting her words without argument. Then his gaze shifted past her, sharpening with focus. "We need to fortify. Turn the house into something defensible. How much time do we have?" "Week at most. Cutter's cautious, but he's not patient. When his scout doesn't report back, he'll assume the worst and come in force." They walked back to the homestead together, and Clara felt the weight of what was coming settle over her shoulders like a physical thing. She'd told Elias she wouldn't run, had insisted on standing and fighting, but the reality of violence, real violence, the kind that ended in bodies and blood, was different from abstract courage. Still, she'd meant what she said. This land was all she had left of her father, all that remained of the life they'd tried to build. She wouldn't surrender it to men who dealt in fear and death. Over the next 3 days, Elias transformed the homestead into a fortress. He reinforced the doors with iron bars salvaged from an old fence, nailed shutters across the windows that could be latched from inside, cleared sight lines around the house so nothing could approach without being seen. He moved supplies into the root cellar, water, ammunition, medical provisions, creating a fallback position if the house became untenable. Clara helped with everything, learning as they worked. Elias showed her how to reload under pressure, how to fire from cover, how to move between positions without exposing herself unnecessarily. He taught her the difference between concealment and cover, between suppressing fire and aimed shots, between fighting to win and fighting to survive long enough for help to arrive. "You're preparing me like a soldier," Clara said one evening as they practiced reloading in the fading light. "I'm preparing you to live through what's coming." Elias corrected the angle of her grip. "Soldiers train for months. We have days. I'm teaching you the minimum you need to not die immediately." Encouraging. "It's honest." He stepped back, watching her reload again. "Better. Do it 20 more times until your hands remember without thinking." Clara repeated the motion over and over until her fingers ached and the rifle felt like an extension of her body. Elias watched without comment, his face etched with concentration, and Clara realized he was terrified, not for himself, but for her. "I won't freeze when it matters," she said quietly. "You don't know that. Neither do you. But you're betting your life on me anyway." Elias met her eyes across the darkening yard. "I'm betting your life on you. That's different." "Is it?" He didn't answer, just turned back toward the barn where he'd been reinforcing the loft into a secondary position. Clara watched him go, understanding finally what drove his relentless preparation. Guilt. Guilt over everyone he'd failed to save, everyone who'd died because they'd been too close when violence found him. She wouldn't be another name on that list. She'd make sure of it. On the fourth day, a rider appeared on the southern road, not approaching, just visible on the horizon, watching. Elias spotted him first and called Clara inside, positioning her at a window with the rifle while he took the opposite side of the house. "Is it them?" Clara asked, heart hammering. "Reconnaissance, confirming I'm here." Elias's voice was flat, controlled. "Don't shoot unless I tell you." They waited for 20 minutes while the rider sat motionless in the distance. Then he turned and disappeared back the way he'd come, leaving nothing but tracks in the snow. "They know," Elias said, "which means they'll be planning their approach. Probably hit us at night, try to use darkness for cover." "How many will come?" "Depends on how much Cutter wants me dead versus how much effort he's willing to spend. Could be 3 men, could be 10. Elias moved away from the window, checking the barricades again. "We planned for 10. Clara's hands shook slightly as she set down the rifle. 10 men against 2. The mathematics were brutal. "Can we win against those odds?" she asked. "We can survive them. Winning's different." Elias pulled out his revolver and began cleaning it with practiced movements. "The house gives us advantage, limited approaches, cover, defendable positions. They'll be in the open. If we're smart and lucky, we can make the cost high enough they decide it's not worth it. And if we're not lucky? Then you get to the root cellar and stay there no matter what you hear above you. When it's quiet, you run for town and tell the sheriff what happened." His hands never stopped moving over the gun. "That's not negotiable, Clara. If it goes wrong, you survive. That's the priority." Clara wanted to argue, to insist she wouldn't abandon him to die alone. But she recognized the look in his eyes, the absolute resolve that brooked no compromise. "All right," she said, "but it won't come to that." "No," Elias agreed, though they both knew he was lying. "It won't." That night, neither of them slept. They took turns watching from different windows, 2-hour shifts that stretched into eternity. Clara found herself listening to every sound: wind against the shutters, mice in the walls, the settling of old wood. Normal sounds that her fear transformed into threats. Around 3 in the morning, during Elias's watch, Clara gave up on sleep and joined him in the kitchen. He sat at the table with the revolver disassembled before him, cleaning each piece with methodical care. "Couldn't sleep either?" Clara asked, pouring herself coffee from the pot he'd kept warm. "Don't sleep much anymore, not since—" He stopped, jaw tightening. "Since what?" Elias was quiet for a long time, his hand still moving over the gun parts. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Since I watched Cutter's men burn a family alive because the father testified against him. Thomas and I were supposed to be protecting them. Federal marshals had promised safe passage, relocation, new identities, but Cutter found them anyway." His hand stilled. "The father died trying to get his children out. The mother jumped from a second-story window with the baby. I pulled 2 kids from the fire, but the youngest, she was only 4. She was already gone by the time I reached her." Clara set down her cup, throat tight. "I can still hear her screaming," Elias continued, his voice hollow. "Every night, every time I close my eyes. She's there calling for help I couldn't give fast enough." "Elias." Thomas got out clean because he didn't hesitate. He grabbed the mother and ran while I was trying to save everyone. He knew you can't save everyone. I had to learn it by watching a child burn. He started reassembling the gun with shaking hands. "That's who you've tied yourself to, Clara. A man who failed when it mattered most." Clara moved around the table and did something she'd never done before. She took the gun from his hands and set it aside, then pulled his head against her stomach and held him while his shoulders shook with silent grief. He didn't cry, didn't make a sound, just trembled like a tree in high wind while she ran her fingers through his hair and whispered meaningless comfort. They stayed like that until the shaking stopped and Elias pulled away, wiping his face roughly. "I'm sorry," he said. "You don't need to see me fall apart." "Everyone falls apart. The question is whether they get back up." Clara sat beside him, close enough that their shoulders touched. "You got those other children out. You saved lives. Not enough of them. Enough that those kids are alive to grow up. Enough that you're still fighting instead of giving up." She took his hand, lacing their fingers together. "That's not failure, Elias. That's courage." He looked at their joined hands like he couldn't quite believe they were real. I don't feel courageous. I feel like a coward who keeps running from ghosts. You're not running anymore. You're standing. Clara squeezed his hand. We both are. Elias turned to face her fully, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw him without armor, raw and vulnerable and human. I can't lose you, he whispered. Clara, I can't go through that again. Then we make sure you don't have to. She leaned forward and kissed him, soft and brief, a gesture of comfort more than passion. Elias went rigid with surprise, then kissed her back with a desperation that spoke of loneliness and fear and desperate hope. When they broke apart, Clara rested her forehead against his. We survived this, she said, together. That's not a hope, Elias. It's a decision. All right. His voice was rough but steadier. Together. They sat in the pre-dawn darkness, holding hands. Two people who'd married as strangers and found something unexpected in the shadow of violence. Not love, not yet, but the foundation it might grow from. When morning came, they returned to preparations with renewed focus. Elias checked the perimeter while Clara organized ammunition and supplies. They moved around each other with easy familiarity. Now the careful distance of their first weeks replaced by unconscious coordination. Around noon, Clara was in the root cellar securing water containers when she heard Elias shout her name. She grabbed the rifle and scrambled up the ladder, emerging into chaos. 5 riders were approaching from the tree line, moving fast, spread out to present multiple targets. Elias was already at the front window, revolver drawn. Positions, he barked. Don't fire until I give the word. Clara ran to the side window he'd assigned her, heart hammering so hard she could barely hear. Through the narrow gap in the shutters, she could see the riders more clearly now, hard men with guns drawn, moving with the coordination of people who'd worked together before. Cutter's men. Finally, here. They're stopping, Elias called from his position. Setting up beyond rifle range. Smart. Clara watched as the riders halted about 300 yards out, far enough to avoid easy shots, but close enough to keep the house pinned. One man dismounted and raised a white cloth tied to a stick. They want to talk, Clara said. It's a trap. Maybe. Or maybe they're assessing our defenses. She looked across the room at Elias. What do we do? Before he could answer, one of the riders cupped his hands and shouted across the distance. Elias Crow, Mr. Cutter wants a word. Elias's jaw clenched. Tell Cutter to go to hell. Now that's not neighborly, the voice carried easily in the cold air. Mr. Cutter's offering you a deal. Come out and talk like civilized men. Nobody needs to get hurt. Your scout came onto my property armed, Elias shouted back. He got hurt plenty. A pause. Then, that was unfortunate. Mr. Cutter regrets the misunderstanding, but he's willing to let bygones be bygones if you're reasonable. Reasonable meaning what? Meaning you come out. We have a conversation. Maybe we reach an understanding that doesn't involve bloodshed. Elias looked at Clara, and she saw the calculation in his eyes. He knew it was a lie, knew they'd kill him the moment he stepped outside, but he was considering it anyway, considering sacrifice to keep her safe. Don't, Clara said quietly. Don't you dare. If I can buy you time to run, no. She moved to his position, keeping below the window line. We agreed. Together. Clara, together, Elias, I'm not negotiating. For a long moment he stared at her, conflict warring across his face. Then he turned back to the window and shouted, Tell Cutter I'm not interested in his deals. He wants me, he can come get me. That's disappointing, the rider sounded almost regretful. Mr. Cutter thought you were smarter than this, Crow. Thought you'd want to protect that pretty wife you picked up. Clara's blood went cold. Guess we'll have to persuade you both, the voice continued. Mr. Cutter's patient. We can wait you out, burn you out, or dig you out. Your choice how this ends, but it's going to end with you dead, and us taking whatever we want from what's left. Elias's hand tightened on his revolver. You threaten her again, and negotiation's over. Negotiation's already over, friend. Now we're just deciding how much you suffer first. The riders retreated back into the tree line, disappearing from view but not from threat. Clara knew they were still there, watching, waiting, planning their approach. They'll come tonight, Elias said quietly. Use darkness to get close. Try to overwhelm us with numbers and firepower. Can we hold them? Depends on how much they want me versus how many men they're willing to lose. He moved away from the window, thinking, we need to make the cost prohibitive, make them bleed for every inch. They spent the afternoon setting traps, tripwires connected to bells, oil-soaked rags positioned to create fire barriers, careful preparation that might buy them seconds when seconds meant life or death. Elias worked with focused intensity, and Clara matched his pace, pushing down fear to focus on what needed doing. As the sun began to set, they took positions inside the house. Elias had assigned Clara the kitchen window with clear sightlines to the eastern approach. He took the front room with views of the main road and northern tree line. Between them, they could cover all likely attack routes. Remember, Elias said as darkness fell, aimed shots. Don't waste ammunition. If they breach the house, fall back to the root cellar and barricade yourself in. And if they breach the cellar, they won't get that far. He said it with absolute conviction, and Clara understood. Elias would die before he let them reach her. She wanted to tell him she loved him, wanted to say all the things fear and circumstance had kept locked inside. But the words felt inadequate, too small for the enormity of what they faced. Instead, she crossed the room and kissed him hard, pouring everything unsaid into the contact. Elias pulled her close, one hand tangling in her hair, kissing her back with desperate intensity. When they broke apart, his eyes were bright with unshed tears. We survived this, he whispered. We survived this, Clara agreed. Then they took their positions and waited for hell to arrive. Full dark came slowly, the sky bleeding through purple into black. Clara's eyes adjusted gradually to the darkness, picking out familiar shapes in the yard. The well, the fence line, the shadow of the barn. Her hands were steady on the rifle despite the fear churning in her gut. An hour passed, then another. The silence stretched taut as wire. Then the first bell rang. The sound was sharp and clear, one of the tripwires near the tree line. Elias's voice cut through the darkness. East side, Clara. Watch for movement. Clara pressed her eye to the narrow gap in the shutters, scanning the darkness. At first she saw nothing, then a shadow detached from the tree line moving low and fast toward the house. I see one, she called quietly. Wait for my signal. The shadow got closer. 30 yards. 20. Clara's finger tightened on the trigger. Now, Elias shouted. Clara fired. The muzzle flash temporarily blinded her, but she heard a scream of pain. The shadow went down hard. Gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Bullets slammed into the shutters, splintering wood. Glass shattered somewhere in the front room. Clara ducked below the window, reloaded, came up firing at another shape approaching from the barn. The house filled with smoke and the deafening roar of weapons. Clara lost track of individual shots, just kept firing and reloading in mechanical rhythm while chaos exploded around her. They're flanking! Elias shouted. Watch the south window! Clara spun and saw shapes rushing the side of the house. She fired twice, saw one man fall, adjusted, and fired again. The second man stumbled, but kept coming. Then fire bloomed in the yard, the oil-soaked rags catching, creating a wall of flame that forced the attackers to retreat or burn. Good, Elias's voice carried over the gunfire. Keep them in the kill zone! Clara's ears rang. Smoke burned her throat. She reloaded again, muscles moving from training rather than thought, and returned to the window. A man was climbing through the eastern shutter, his arm bleeding but his gun steady. Clara swung the rifle toward him but wasn't fast enough. He fired first. The bullet caught her in the shoulder, spinning her around and slamming her into the wall. Pain exploded white-hot through her body. She hit the floor hard, the rifle clattering from her grip. Through the ringing in her ears, she heard Elias scream her name. Then a gunshot, close and deafening. The man climbing through the window fell backward, half his head gone. Elias was suddenly beside her, his face white with terror. Clara! Clara, talk to me! Shoulder, she gasped. Not dead! Jesus Christ! His hands were on her, checking the wound with shaking fingers. It went through. You're bleeding, but... Clara, I need to get you to the cellar. No. She grabbed his shirt with her good hand. No running. We fight. You're shot! I can still shoot back. Clara struggled to sit up despite the agony radiating from her shoulder. Help me up. Clara, help me up, Elias. Now. He stared at her for a heartbeat, conflict and admiration and fear warring across his face. Then he carefully lifted her to her feet, supporting her weight while she grabbed the rifle with her left hand. Outside, the gunfire had slowed. Clara could hear men shouting, regrouping. "They'll rush us again," Elias said. "All at once. Try to overwhelm our position. Then we make them pay for it." Clara's vision swam, but she forced herself to focus. "How many did we get?" "3 down for sure, maybe 4. He helped her to a different window, one with cover. "That leaves at least 1 still mobile, probably 2. Those are better odds." "Those are still suicide odds for you." Elias pressed his forehead against hers. "Clara, please, get to safety while you can." "Where you go, I go." She pulled back to look him in the eyes. "That's the deal, remember? Together." Before he could argue, a voice shouted from the darkness, "Crow, we're coming in! Last chance to surrender!" Elias returned to his position, raised his voice. "Come on then, let's finish this." A moment of breathless silence. Then they came. 2 men rushed from different directions, firing as they ran. Elias dropped one with 2 shots, but the second made it to the front door and slammed into it with his shoulder. The barricade held, but barely. The man fired through the door. Wood exploded inward. Elias ducked right while Clara fired left-handed through the gap. Her shot went wide, but close enough to force the attacker back. Then the door gave way. The man burst through, gun swinging toward Elias. Clara didn't think, just fired. The bullet caught him center mass and he went down choking. Silence crashed over the homestead like a physical weight. Clara and Elias stood among the wreckage, breathing hard, covered in blood and smoke and plaster dust. For a long moment, neither moved, both waiting for the next attack. But none came. "Is it over?" Clara whispered. Elias moved to the broken door, scanning the yard with his revolver raised. "I count 4 bodies. If there was a 5th man, he's running." Clara slid down the wall, sudden exhaustion overwhelming her. The adrenaline was fading, leaving only pain and shock in its wake. Elias was beside her instantly, checking her wound. "We need to get this cleaned and bandaged. Can you make it to the kitchen?" "I think so." He helped her up and half-carried her to the table, then grabbed clean cloth and whiskey. The next few minutes were agony as he cleaned the wound and bound it tight. Clara bit down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. When it was done, Elias sat back, his hands shaking. "You could have died." "So could you." "That's different. I've been living on borrowed time for years. His voice broke. "Clara, you have a life ahead of you. You shouldn't have risked it for me." "I didn't risk it for you." Clara reached up with her good hand and touched his face. "I risked it for us. For what we're building here. For the future we might have if we're brave enough to claim it." Elias caught her hand and held it against his cheek, his eyes closing. "I don't deserve you." "Probably not. But you're stuck with me anyway." He laughed, a broken sound that might have been a sob, and kissed her palm. Outside, the first light of dawn was touching the horizon. The battle was over. They'd survived. But the cost was written in blood and bullet holes and the knowledge that violence could return at any time. Still, Clara thought, as exhaustion pulled her toward sleep, they'd stood together. They'd fought together. And that, at least, was worth something. Clara woke to pain and the smell of smoke still clinging to everything. Morning light filtered through the shattered shutters, illuminating a house transformed into a battlefield. Bullet holes pocked the walls. Glass littered the floor. Dark stains marked where men had bled and died. She tried to sit up and gasped as fire shot through her shoulder. Immediately, Elias was there, pressing her gently back down onto the makeshift bed he'd arranged on the kitchen floor. "Easy," he said. "You lost blood. You need to rest." The bodies, already buried, before dawn. His face was haggard, eyes rimmed red with exhaustion. "I couldn't leave them lying in the yard for you to see." Clara studied him in the growing light. He'd cleaned the blood from his hands and face, changed his shirt, but weariness clung to him like a shroud. She wondered if he'd slept at all, or if he'd spent the dark hours disposing of the dead and fortifying against another attack that might never come. "How bad is the house?" she asked. "Repairable. The door needs replacing, shutters need fixing, but the structure's sound." He helped her drink water from a tin cup. "We were lucky. Could have been so much worse." "Elias," Clara caught his hand, We won. They're gone. 4 of them are gone. Cutter's still out there, and now he knows exactly what we can do. Elias pulled away, moving to the window to scan the empty yard. He'll send more men, better prepared next time, more of them. Or he'll decide we're not worth the cost. Men like Cutter don't think that way. Every person who defies him and lives becomes a threat to his power. He can't let that stand. Elias's voice was flat, defeated. I should leave. Draw him away from here before he brings an army. No. Clara struggled to sit up despite the pain. We've had this conversation. You're not leaving. Clara, be reasonable. I am being reasonable. You leave. I'm defenseless against whoever Cutter sends next. You stay. We have a chance. She met his eyes across the damaged room. Besides, you don't get to make my decisions for me. This is my home. My fight now. Elias looked like he wanted to argue, but something in her expression stopped him. Instead, he returned to her side and helped her sit up properly, arranging pillows behind her back. You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met, he said quietly. Good thing you married me then. A ghost of a smile touched his mouth. Yeah, good thing. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of survival settling over them. Then Clara asked the question that had been burning in her mind since the gunfire stopped. Did any of them get away? 1, maybe 2. Hard to count in the dark. Elias's jaw tightened. Which means Cutter knows for certain now. Knows where I am, knows I won't come quietly, knows you're here too. The implication hung heavy between them. Clara had become a target simply by standing beside Elias. Any future attack would account for her, would seek to use her as leverage or eliminate her as a threat. We need help, Clara said. The sheriff's office is 3 miles away in a town of maybe 200 people. He's got 1 deputy and jurisdiction that covers 3 counties. By the time he could organize anything resembling a response, we'd be dead. Elias shook his head. Law doesn't move fast enough out here to matter. Then what do we do? We prepare for the next attack, and He stopped, conflict warring across his face. I have an idea, but you're not going to like it. Tell me anyway. Elias took a breath. I could go to Covenant, send a telegram to the federal marshals who handled Cutter's original case. They have jurisdiction over crimes that cross state lines, and Cutter's operation definitely qualifies. If I can convince them to come, how long would that take? Week. Maybe 2 for them to mobilize. 2 weeks where you're exposed in town, where anyone could recognize you, where Cutter could send someone to finish what they started. Clara shook her head despite the pain it caused. Too dangerous. Staying here is dangerous too. At least this way we'd have reinforcements coming eventually. Clara considered it. The plan had merit. Bringing in federal law enforcement would shift the balance of power dramatically. But the risk of Elias being caught alone, vulnerable, away from the defensible position they'd built here, made her chest tight with fear. We go together, she said finally. You're injured. I can ride. And I'm not letting you walk into town alone like a target in a shooting gallery. Clara struggled to her feet, using Elias's shoulder for support. We go together or we don't go at all. Elias looked like he wanted to argue, but he'd learned by now that Clara's stubbornness matched his own. All right. Together. But we wait until tomorrow. Give you time to heal a bit more. Agreed. They spent the rest of the day fortifying and healing. Elias boarded up the broken door and shutters while Clara rested and regained strength. By evening, she could move around the house with minimal pain, though her right arm remained mostly useless. As darkness fell, they ate together at the kitchen table. Simple food that tasted like survival. Elias had cooked, something Clara had never seen him do before, and the gesture felt intimate in ways that went beyond sustenance. You're a better cook than I expected, Clara said. Learned young. Had to, being orphaned. Elias pushed food around his plate. Thomas tried to teach me fancy recipes, but I never got the hang of anything more complicated than stew. Thomas sounds like he was a good friend. The best. Elias's voice softened with grief. He saw something in me worth saving when everyone else just saw a lost cause. Believed I could be more than what my past made me. He was right. Was he? Elias met her eyes. Look at what I brought to your doorstep, Clara. Death and violence and men who want to burn your home to the ground. That's not salvation. That's a curse. Clara reached across the table and took his hand. You also brought protection when I had none. Partnership when I was alone. Someone willing to stand and fight instead of running. She squeezed his fingers. That's not a curse, Elias. That's exactly what I needed. I don't know how to be what you deserve. You don't have to be anything except yourself. That's enough. Elias looked down at their joined hands, his thumb tracing small circles on her palm. When this is over, if we survive, I want to do this right. Court you properly. Give you a real marriage instead of this arrangement we fell into. Clara's heart stuttered. You want to stay? If you'll have me, not as a hired hand or a name on paper, but as a real husband, a partner. He raised his eyes to hers. I know I'm not what you ordered, not the gentle schoolteacher who wrote poetry, but I'm what showed up, and somewhere along the way I fell in love with you. The words hung in the air between them, fragile and fierce. Clara stood, ignoring the pain in her shoulder, and moved around the table to stand before him. Elias looked up at her with naked vulnerability, all his armor stripped away. I fell in love with you too, Clara said quietly, somewhere between the fence repairs and the shooting lessons and the night you held me while I cried. You're not what I ordered, Elias Crow. You're so much better. She leaned down and kissed him, slow and deep, pouring everything she felt into the contact. Elias pulled her carefully onto his lap, mindful of her injury, and kissed her back with a tenderness that made her chest ache. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Elias rested his forehead against hers. We survive this, he whispered. We build something real. No more running, no more hiding, just us and this land and whatever future we can make. Together, Clara agreed. They sat like that for a long time, holding each other in the lamplight, while the damaged house creaked around them and the night pressed close. Tomorrow they would ride to town and send for help. Tomorrow they would face whatever danger waited on the road. But tonight they had each other, and that was enough. Morning came cold and clear. Clara woke in Elias's arms, both of them having fallen asleep fully clothed in the kitchen chair, unwilling to separate even for the sake of comfort. Her shoulder throbbed, but the pain had dulled to something manageable. Elias stirred as she moved, his hand immediately going to his revolver before consciousness fully returned. Then he saw her and relaxed, some of the constant tension leaving his shoulders. Morning, he said, voice rough with sleep. Morning. We should get ready. They prepared for the journey with careful efficiency. Elias saddled both horses while Clara packed supplies. Ammunition, food, the marriage certificate from Pastor Henriksen that proved their legal union. She caught her reflection in the cracked mirror above the wash basin and barely recognized herself. 3 weeks ago, she'd been a desperate woman waiting on a train platform. Now she was someone harder, someone who'd killed men and survived a siege and fallen in love with a dangerous stranger. The transformation should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like finally becoming who she was always meant to be. They rode out as the sun climbed toward noon, both armed, both watchful. The road to Covenant stretched empty before them, but Elias kept them off the main track, choosing instead to follow the tree line where cover was available. If anyone's waiting in ambush, they'll expect us on the road, he explained. We stay in the trees. We might see them before they see us. Clara nodded, her good hand steady on her rifle, while the reins rested loose on her saddle horn. Every shadow made her pulse jump. Every distant sound sent adrenaline spiking through her veins. This was what Elias had lived with for years. Constant vigilance, never truly safe, always waiting for violence to find him. She understood now why he'd tried so hard to push her away. They were halfway to town when Elias held up a hand, halting. Clara pulled her horse alongside his, following his gaze to a point ahead where the trail narrowed between two rocky outcroppings. Perfect ambush point, Elias said quietly. If I were setting a trap, that's where I'd do it. Can we go around? Would add an hour, and if they've got scouts, they'll see us making the detour and reposition. He studied the terrain with a tactical eye. We could wait them out, see if anyone shows themselves, or we could spring the trap on our terms instead of theirs. Elias looked at her sharply. What are you thinking? You go wide, circle around behind. I ride through the middle, draw their attention. When they reveal themselves, you have a clean shot from behind cover. Absolutely not. You're injured and they'd cut you down before. I'm bait, not a target. I keep moving, stay low, make myself hard to hit. By the time they get a beat on me, you're already shooting. Clara met his eyes. You taught me to think tactically. This is tactical. This is suicide. No, staying here arguing while they potentially reposition is suicide. This is the best chance we have. She leaned over and kissed him quickly. Trust me, I'm not planning to die today. Elias looked torn, clearly hating the plan, but unable to find a better alternative. Finally, he nodded. You stay low. You keep moving, and the second you hear gunfire, you get off that horse and find cover. Understood? Understood. He circled wide, disappearing into the trees. Clara waited, counting her heartbeats, giving him time to get into position. Then she urged her horse forward at a steady walk, rifle held casually across her saddle but finger near the trigger. The trail narrowed. Rock walls rose on either side. Clara's spine prickled with the sensation of being watched. Then a man stepped out from behind a boulder, rifle raised. That's far enough, Mrs. Crow. Clara halted, keeping her expression neutral despite the fear flooding her system. The man was young, maybe 25, with a hard face and cold eyes. Behind him, another figure moved, a second gunman covering from elevation. You know my name, Clara said. Should I know yours? Name's Pike. I work for Mr. Cutter. The man smiled without warmth. He's real interested in having a conversation with you and your husband. My husband's not here. Now see, I don't believe that. Man like Crow doesn't let his woman ride alone. Not with how things have been going lately. Pike's smile widened. So why don't you tell him to come out so we can all talk civilized? Clara's mind raced. Elias would be in position by now, waiting for her signal or for Pike to make a mistake. She just needed to keep them talking, keep their attention on her. Mr. Crow went ahead to Covenant, she said. Sent me back for supplies we forgot. Convenient. Pike took a step closer. Guess that means you're alone and unprotected. Vulnerable, even. I wouldn't say unprotected. Clara shifted her rifle fractionally. I did fine in the last fight. 4 against 2 and you got lucky. Won't happen again. Pike's finger tightened on his trigger. Now you're going to dismount real slow and come with us. Mr. Cutter wants to meet the woman stupid enough to marry Elias Crow. I think I'll pass. Wasn't a request. The second gunman raised his rifle, aiming directly at Clara's chest. She calculated distances, angles, the time it would take to swing her own weapon to bear. The numbers didn't favor her survival. Then Elias's voice cut through the tension. Drop the weapons, or I put bullets in both of you. Pike spun, bringing his rifle around. The second gunman tried to track the new threat. Neither was fast enough. Elias fired twice from his position in the rocks above. The first shot caught the elevated gunman in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering down the slope. The second shot hit Pike in the leg, dropping him to his knees. Clara brought her own rifle up, covering both men as Elias descended from the rocks. He moved like water, smooth and controlled, his revolver never wavering from the targets. Clara, you hurt? He called without taking his eyes off Pike. No, I'm good. Elias reached Pike and kicked away the fallen rifle, then checked the second man who was groaning and clutching his bleeding shoulder. Satisfied neither posed an immediate threat, he turned his attention fully to Pike. Where's Cutter? Pike laughed despite the pain. You think I'm going to tell you that? I think you will, because the alternative is me leaving you here to bleed out. Elias's voice was flat, emotionless. Clock's ticking, Pike. Where is he? Go to hell, Crow. Elias shrugged and turned toward his horse. All right. Enjoy dying slowly. Wait! Pike's bravado cracked. Wait, Jesus Christ. He's in Covenant, at the hotel. Moved in 2 days ago with 6 men, waiting for you to come to him. Clara's blood went cold. 6 men. In town. Where innocent people could get caught in crossfire. Elias clearly had the same thought. His face went hard as stone. How many men does he have total? Counting us? 8, counting the ones you already killed? Pike spat blood. You've put a serious dent in his crew, Crow. He's not happy about it. Good. Elias pulled bandages from his saddlebag and tossed them to Pike. Patch yourself up. Then you and your friend get on your horses and ride. Tell Cutter I'm coming for him, and he better have his affairs in order. You're letting us go. I'm giving you a chance to walk away. What you do with it is your choice." Elias mounted his horse. "But if I see either of you again, I won't miss vital organs next time." Pike stared at him with something between hatred and grudging respect. Then he nodded and crawled toward his injured companion. Elias and Clara rode hard for Covenant, pushing the horses as fast as they dared. The revelation that Cutter had brought his fight into town changed everything. They couldn't just send a telegram and wait. They needed to act now, before innocent people died. "We need a plan," Clara said as the town's buildings came into view. "The plan is I walk into that hotel and end this." Elias's voice was grim. 6 against 1 isn't great odds, but it's better than letting him terrorize the whole town. 6 against 2, Clara corrected. "No, this is where you stay safe, remember? That was the deal." "The deal was I run if the house is overrun. The house is 3 miles behind us." Clara pulled her horse alongside his. "I'm not letting you walk into a death trap alone, Elias." "Not when there's another way." "What other way?" Clara thought fast, assembling pieces of a plan that might just work. "We get the sheriff involved. Make this official. Cutter's a wanted fugitive. The law has every right to arrest him. We give the sheriff information, let him deputize some men, make this a legal action instead of a shootout." "You think the sheriff's going to risk his life for an out-of-town problem?" "I think he'll do his job if we give him no choice. And if he won't," Clara's voice hardened, "then we do what needs doing and deal with the consequences after." Elias studied her for a long moment, conflict clear on his face. Then he nodded. "All right, we try it your way first. But Clara, if this goes wrong, if it turns into a fight, I know, I run. You've made that very clear." "I'm serious." "So am I." She reached over and squeezed his hand. "But it won't come to that. Trust me." They rode into Covenant as the afternoon sun began its descent. The town looked peaceful, normal, people going about their business unaware that death waited in the hotel at the end of Main Street. Clara spotted Pastor Henriksen outside the church and Mrs. Ingrid at the general store. Normal life, fragile as glass, about to shatter. The sheriff's office sat between the bank and the barber shop, a squat building with iron bars on the windows. Sheriff Tom Crawford was a solid man in his 50s, competent if not inspired, with a reputation for keeping the peace through common sense rather than gunplay. He looked up as Elias and Clara entered, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern as he registered their weapons and the intensity in their eyes. "Mrs. Crow, Mr. Crow." He stood, hand resting casually near his own sidearm. "What brings you to town armed like you're going to war?" "Because we are," Elias said bluntly. "There's a wanted fugitive in your hotel with 6 armed men. Name's Jack Cutter. Federal warrants for his arrest on multiple charges including murder, extortion, and racketeering." Crawford's face went carefully neutral. "That's a serious accusation. You have proof?" "I have testimony. I'm the one who put him in prison the first time." Elias pulled out papers from his coat, old court documents, worn and creased. "These are copies of the federal case. Cutter's been hunting everyone who testified against him. He killed Thomas Merritt in Kansas. He tried to kill me and my wife at our homestead 3 nights ago. He's here now, waiting for his next opportunity." The sheriff examined the documents with deliberate care. When he looked up, his expression was grave. "If this is accurate, we've got a significant problem. 6 armed men in my town terrorizing citizens." "They haven't terrorized anyone yet," Clara interjected. "They're waiting for us. This is personal between Cutter and my husband, but it won't stay personal if innocent people get caught in the middle." Crawford nodded slowly. "What are you proposing?" "Deputize me and some trusted men," Elias said. "We go to the hotel, make it official, arrest Cutter under federal warrant. If he resists, we respond with appropriate force. And if he doesn't resist? If he demands a hearing, due process? Then you hold him until federal marshals arrive and let them handle it." Elias leaned forward. "But Sheriff, I know this man. He won't go quietly. He'll fight, and when he does, people will die. Better we control when and where that happens than let him choose the battlefield." Crawford was quiet for a long moment, weighing the options. Finally, he stood and pulled a deputy badge from his desk drawer. "All right, I'll deputize you, Crow, but this is done by the book. We approach with legal authority, we offer surrender, and we only shoot if fired upon first. He pinned the badge to Elias's coat. I've got 2 men I trust, my deputy and the blacksmith. That gives us 4 against their 6. Not great odds, but it'll have to do. 5, Clara said. Both men looked at her. Mrs. Crow, with respect, this isn't, Crawford began. My husband and I survived an attack on our home 3 nights ago. I killed 2 men defending our property. I can shoot, I can follow orders, and I have as much right to see this through as anyone. Clara's voice was steel. Deputize me or don't, but I'm coming either way. Crawford looked to Elias, clearly expecting him to object, but Elias just nodded. She's earned it, Sheriff, and we need every gun we can get. The sheriff sighed and pulled out another badge. Against my better judgment. But you follow orders, Mrs. Crow. No heroics, no independent action. Clear? Clear. Within the hour they'd assembled. Deputy Jim Harris was a lean man in his 40s with sharp eyes and steady hands. The blacksmith, a giant named Samuel, who'd served in the army, carried a rifle like it was part of his body. Together with Elias, Clara, and Sheriff Crawford, they made a small but determined force. They gathered in the sheriff's office to plan their approach. Elias spread a rough sketch of the hotel on the desk. Front entrance here, rear exit through the kitchen. 2 stories, 6 rooms upstairs where Cutter's likely positioned his men. Main floor has the lobby, dining room, and bar. He tapped specific points. We want to control both exits and force them into the lobby where there's minimal cover. Sheriff and Deputy Harris take the front. Samuel and I take the rear. Clara, you stay in position across the street with a rifle, covering the upper windows. I should be inside with you, Clara argued. You should be where you can do the most good. Those upper windows give shooters advantage over anyone in the lobby. You keep them from using that advantage. Elias met her eyes. This isn't about keeping you safe, Clara. This is tactics. She wanted to argue, but recognized he was right. From across the street with a good vantage point, she could cover multiple angles and provide suppressing fire if needed. All right, she agreed, but if you get in trouble, then you provide covering fire while we retreat. That's the plan for everyone. Sheriff Crawford looked around at his makeshift posse. This is not about being heroes. This is about arresting a fugitive with minimal bloodshed. Everyone goes home alive. Understood? They all nodded. As the sun touched the horizon, painting Covenant in gold and shadow, they moved into position. Clara took her spot in the 2nd story of the general store across from the hotel, setting up by a window with a clear view of the building's facade. Below, she could see Elias and Samuel moving toward the rear entrance while Crawford and Harris approached the front. Her heart hammered so hard she could barely hear anything else. The sheriff reached the hotel door and paused, hand on the knob. Then he pushed through, voice carrying across the street. Jack Cutter, this is Sheriff Crawford. You're under arrest by federal warrant. Come out peacefully, and nobody gets hurt. For a moment, nothing happened. Then gunfire erupted from the upper windows. Clara didn't think, just reacted. She brought her rifle up and fired at the muzzle flash, working the bolt and firing again. Glass shattered. Someone screamed. Below, Crawford and Harris had taken cover behind an overturned table in the lobby. Return fire came from multiple directions. Cutter's men had spread throughout the hotel, creating a deadly crossfire. Clara kept shooting, targeting anyone who appeared in the windows, forcing them back from their positions. Her shoulder screamed with pain, but adrenaline pushed her through it. Then she saw Elias and Samuel breach the rear door, coming in fast and low. Elias moved like violence personified, his revolver barking as he advanced through the kitchen. Samuel followed, his rifle finding targets with deadly precision. The battle lasted maybe 3 minutes, but felt like hours. Clara's ears rang with the constant crack of gunfire. Smoke filled the hotel lobby. Men shouted, cursed, died. Then silence crashed down so suddenly it felt unreal. Clara's finger remained on the trigger, scanning for targets, but the windows stayed empty. No more muzzle flashes, no more movement. Cease fire! Crawford's voice carried from the hotel. Cease fire! It's over! Clara lowered her rifle with shaking hands and waited. Minutes later, Elias emerged from the hotel, blood on his face but walking under his own power. He looked up at her window and nodded once, a simple gesture that meant everything. He was alive. They'd won. Clara descended to the street on legs that barely held her, reaching Elias just as he stepped onto the boardwalk. She didn't care about propriety or witnesses. She threw her good arm around him and held on tight while he buried his face in her hair. "It's done," he whispered. "Clara, it's done." Behind them, the sheriff and his deputies were bringing out bodies and prisoners. Of Cutter's 6 men, 3 were dead, 2 wounded and captured, and 1, Cutter himself, had taken a bullet to the chest and was barely breathing. Clara and Elias stood together in the fading light, holding each other while the town slowly came back to life around them. Pastor Henriksen approached with medical supplies. Mrs. Ingrid brought water. Others emerged from buildings where they'd taken shelter, faces pale but grateful. "You saved the town," Crawford said, approaching them. "Could have been a massacre if you hadn't contained it to the hotel." "We did what needed doing," Elias said simply. "Still, Covenant owes you both a debt." The sheriff removed the deputy badges from their coats. "I'll send word to the federal marshals. They'll want statements, but you're free to go home whenever you're ready." Home. The word settled over Clara like a benediction. They stayed long enough to give initial statements and ensure the wounded received medical attention. Cutter died before midnight, never regaining consciousness to face justice for his crimes. His surviving men would be transported to federal custody within days. As the moon rose over Covenant, Elias and Clara finally mounted their horses and turned toward the homestead. Neither spoke much during the ride, both too exhausted and overwhelmed for words. But when they finally saw their land in the distance, damaged but standing, waiting for them to return and rebuild, Clara felt something loosen in her chest. They'd survived. Together. And tomorrow, they would begin the work of turning survival into something that looked like life. The homestead looked different in the moonlight as they approached. Not damaged, not broken, but transformed into something that belonged to them in ways it never had before. Every bullet hole, every shattered shutter, every blood stain scrubbed from the floorboards would become part of their story, proof that they'd stood when standing mattered most. Elias dismounted first and helped Clara down, his hands lingering at her waist longer than necessary. She leaned into him, exhaustion and relief making her legs unsteady. "We should sleep," he said quietly. "Actually sleep. For the first time in days." "Together?" Clara asked, then felt heat rise to her cheeks at her own boldness. Elias smiled. A real smile, soft and genuine in the darkness. "Together, if you want." "I want." They tended the horses in companionable silence, then walked into the damaged house that somehow felt more like home than it ever had when it was pristine and empty. Clara watched Elias bank the fire and check the barricaded door one last time, old habits dying hard, even with the immediate threat ended. When he finally turned toward her, some of the constant vigilance had eased from his shoulders. He looked younger, lighter, as if laying Cutter to rest had lifted a weight he'd carried so long he'd forgotten it was there. "Clara." He crossed to where she stood by the bedroom door. "I need to say something before this goes any further." Fear spiked through her. "What is it?" "I love you. I know I said it before, but I need you to understand what that means." He took her hands in his. "It means I'm done running, done hiding, done living like a ghost waiting for death to catch up. Whatever we build here, I'm building it with you for the rest of my life. No conditions, no escape routes, just us." Clara's throat tightened with emotion. "I love you too, and I'm not afraid anymore. Not of the future, not of what people will say, not of anything as long as you're standing beside me. Not beside you." Elias pulled her close, careful of her injured shoulder. "With you. Partners in everything." She kissed him then, deep and slow, pouring everything she felt into the contact. Elias responded with a tenderness that made her chest ache, his hands gentle as they moved over her back, her face, her hair. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Clara took his hand and led him into the bedroom. They helped each other undress with careful reverence, navigating buttons and bandages, discovering each other by lamplight and touch. There was no urgency, no desperation, just two people choosing each other with clear eyes and full hearts. They made love slowly, gently, learning the landscape of each other's bodies and souls. Every touch was a promise, every whispered word a vow more binding than any ceremony. And when they finally lay tangled together in the darkness, Clara felt something settle deep in her bones. This was home. Not the house or the land, but this, the warmth of Elias's skin against hers, the steady rhythm of his breathing, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she belonged. "I never thought I'd have this," Elias murmured against her hair. "Peace, love, a future that didn't involve looking over my shoulder. You have it now." Clara traced lazy patterns on his chest. "We both do." They fell asleep wrapped around each other, and for the first time since Clara could remember, the silence of the homestead felt comforting rather than lonely. Morning came gentle, sunlight streaming through the gaps in the shutters. Clara woke to find Elias already awake, watching her with an expression so soft it made her heart skip. "Morning," she whispered. "Morning." He brushed hair from her face. "How's the shoulder?" "Sore, but manageable." She stretched carefully, testing her range of motion. "I'll live." "Yes, you will." He kissed her forehead. "We both will. For a very long time." They rose slowly, reluctant to leave the cocoon of warmth and intimacy. But work waited. The homestead needed serious repairs, and winter was coming fast. They couldn't afford to waste daylight on comfort when survival still required preparation. Over breakfast, they made plans. The door and shutters would be first priority, then patching the bullet holes before cold air made the house unlivable. The barn needed attention too, and the fence line required reinforcement before snow made the work impossible. "It's going to take weeks to get everything fixed," Clara said, surveying the damage in clear morning light. "Then we have weeks together to fix it." Elias refilled her coffee. "I'm not going anywhere, Clara. For the first time in my life, I have a reason to stay." A knock at the door interrupted them. Both tensed instinctively, hands moving toward weapons before conscious thought caught up. Then Pastor Henriksen's voice called through the damaged wood. "It's John Henriksen. I've brought Ingrid and some supplies." Elias opened the door to find half the town gathered in the yard. The pastor and his wife, the blacksmith Samuel, with lumber loaded on a wagon, Deputy Harris with tools, even stern Mrs. Patterson from the boarding house carrying baskets of food. More people kept arriving as Clara watched from the doorway, stunned into silence. "What's all this?" Elias asked, clearly as overwhelmed as Clara felt. Pastor Henriksen stepped forward, his kind face serious. "You saved our town, both of you. Put yourselves in harm's way to protect people you barely knew. The least we can do is help rebuild what was damaged in the process." "We didn't do it for recognition," Clara said. "We did it because it needed doing." "Which is exactly why we're here." Mrs. Patterson set down her baskets with firm authority. "You've been alone out here too long, Clara Whitmore. Crow, I should say. Time you learned what community means in a place like Covenant." Tears pricked Clara's eyes. She'd spent 6 months in isolation, convinced she had to carry every burden alone. Now people who'd been distant neighbors were offering hands and hammers and kindness. Elias looked at Clara, a question in his eyes. She nodded, and he turned back to the assembled group. "We'd be grateful for the help," he said quietly. "Thank you." What followed was organized chaos. Samuel and his apprentices tackled the structural repairs, while Deputy Harris and the pastor worked on the shutters. Mrs. Henriksen and Mrs. Patterson descended on the bullet holes with plaster and paint, transforming destruction into something that looked almost intentional. Other women Clara barely knew worked in the kitchen, preparing food enough to feed an army. Clara found herself swept into the communal effort, her injured shoulder exempting her from heavy labor, but not from participation. She worked alongside Ingrid Henriksen mixing plaster, learning the names of people who'd been faceless strangers before. "You've made quite an impression," Ingrid said quietly as they worked. "People are talking about you and Mr. Crow, about how you stood together against impossible odds. People always talk." Clara kept her voice neutral, waiting for judgment. "Yes, but this time they're saying good things, that you're brave, that your husband is honorable despite his rough exterior, that perhaps Covenant could use more people willing to fight for what's right." Ingrid smiled. "You've earned respect, Clara. Don't dismiss it." Clara looked around the yard where neighbors worked together rebuilding her home and felt something crack open in her chest. She'd been so focused on survival that she'd forgotten what it meant to belong somewhere, to be part of something larger than just herself. By the time the sun began its descent, the homestead looked transformed. The door hung straight and strong. Fresh shutters covered the windows. Bullet holes had vanished under new plaster. Even the barn showed evidence of repair, its damaged roof now watertight against coming winter. As people prepared to leave, Pastor Henriksen pulled Clara and Elias aside. "I wanted to speak with you both about something." He glanced at his wife, who nodded encouragingly. "Your wedding was unconventional, rushed, done out of necessity rather than celebration." Clara tensed, wondering if he meant to challenge the validity of their marriage. "I'd like to offer you a proper ceremony," the pastor continued, "if you want one. Something public, with the whole community as witnesses. A chance to make vows freely chosen rather than forced by circumstance." Elias and Clara exchanged glances, an entire conversation happening in the space of heartbeats. "We'd like that," Clara said. "Very much." "Good. Then we'll plan it for next month, after the harvest is fully in and before the heavy snows come." Henriksen smiled warmly. "Give you time to heal and settle, and give the town something to celebrate after all the darkness." As the last wagon pulled away, Clara and Elias stood together in the yard, watching dust settle in the fading light. The homestead looked almost like it had before violence found them, but better somehow, marked by the hands of community, blessed by the kindness of neighbors. "I never expected this," Elias said quietly. "Acceptance, belonging, a future that looks like more than just survival." "Neither did I." Clara leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his body. "But here we are anyway. Here we are." Over the following weeks, they fell into a rhythm that felt like building a life rather than just maintaining existence. Elias worked the land with renewed purpose, no longer just repairing what was broken, but improving, expanding, planning for seasons and years ahead. Clara found herself drawn to the garden, plotting spring plantings and dreaming of abundance instead of mere subsistence. They talked in the evenings, real conversations about hopes and fears and the small details that made up a shared life. Elias told her about his childhood in Tennessee, about losing his parents young and drifting west in search of purpose. Clara shared memories of her mother, of the dreams she'd abandoned when survival became paramount, of the loneliness that had driven her to answer a matrimonial advertisement. "Do you regret it?" Elias asked one night as they lay in bed, wrapped around each other. "Sending those letters? Getting me instead of Thomas?" Clara considered the question honestly. "I regret that Thomas died, but I don't regret getting you. You're not what I ordered, but you're exactly what I needed." "A gunman with more scars than sense?" "A partner. Someone strong enough to stand when everything falls apart. Someone brave enough to be vulnerable." She kissed his shoulder. "Someone I love more than I thought possible." Elias pulled her closer, his voice rough with emotion. "I'd given up on deserving love. Thought I'd used up my chances, burned too many bridges. Then you stood in a train station and didn't run when you saw what I was." "I saw who you were." "That's different." "Is it?" "Yes." Clara propped herself up to look at him. "What you were is a man shaped by violence and loss. Who you are is someone honorable enough to keep a dying man's promise, even when it meant facing your demons. That's the man I fell in love with, Elias Crow. Not the gunfighter, not the fugitive. You." He kissed her then, deep and thorough, and they lost themselves in each other until dawn painted the sky gold. The wedding was set for the second Saturday in November, giving Clara's shoulder time to heal and allowing the community to prepare a proper celebration. Ingrid Henriksen helped Clara sew a simple but beautiful dress from cream-colored wool, while Samuel the blacksmith forged them proper rings to replace the borrowed band from their first ceremony. Elias grew nervous as the day approached, unused to being the center of attention for anything other than violence. Clara found him in the barn 2 days before the ceremony, staring at his reflection in a bucket of water like it held answers to questions he couldn't articulate. "Having second thoughts?" she asked gently. "About marrying you?" "Never." He straightened, turning to face her. about standing in front of the whole town and pretending I'm worthy of you every day. You're worthy, Elias. You've proven it 100 times over. Have I? Or have I just survived long enough to fool people into thinking I've changed? Clara crossed to him and took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. You saved a town. You protected me with your life. You kept a promise to a dead man even when it cost you everything. That's not survival, that's character. And I'm tired of you acting like you're still the man you used to be when every action proves you're someone better. I killed 4 men on your property, Clara. Shot them down without hesitation. To protect our home, our life. That's not murder, Elias. That's defense. And if you'd hesitated, we'd both be dead. She softened her voice. I know you carry guilt. I know the weight of those deaths sits heavy, but you can't let that darkness convince you that you don't deserve light too. Elias closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. What if I fail you? What if someday I'm not strong enough or fast enough or good enough? Then we figure it out together. That's what marriage means, not perfection, but partnership. Not never failing, but getting back up. Clara kissed him softly. I'm not asking you to be flawless, Elias. I'm asking you to be mine. Can you do that? He opened his eyes, and Clara saw tears tracking down his weathered face. Yeah, he whispered. Yeah, I can do that. Good. Then stop worrying about being worthy and focus on being happy. We've earned it. The wedding day dawned clear and cold, winter promising its arrival in the sharp air and frosted ground. The church filled early, nearly every resident of Covenant squeezing into the pews to witness the union. Clara stood in the small antechamber with Ingrid, heart hammering with anticipation rather than fear. You look beautiful, Ingrid said, adjusting Clara's dress. And happy. That's what matters most. I am happy. For the first time in longer than I can remember, I'm genuinely happy. Then let's not keep your husband waiting. The ceremony was simple but profound. Pastor Henriksen spoke about love forged in adversity, about partnership built on respect and courage, about 2 people choosing each other despite every reason to walk away. When he asked for the vows, Clara and Elias faced each other with the whole community as witnesses. Clara, Elias began, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes, I came to you as a broken man keeping a dead man's promise. You saw past the violence and fear to something I'd forgotten existed, a person worth loving. You stood beside me when standing meant risking everything. You chose me not once, but over and over, even when I gave you reasons to run. I promise to be worthy of that choice every day for the rest of my life. I promise to be your partner, your protector, and your equal. I promise to build a future with you that honors both the darkness we survived and the light we found together. Clara's eyes filled with tears. She took a breath and spoke her own vows. Elias, I ordered a husband and received a stranger with a gun. I was terrified and desperate and convinced I'd made a terrible mistake. But you showed me that sometimes the things we don't expect are exactly what we need. You taught me to be strong without being hard, to fight without losing compassion, to survive without giving up on living. You gave me partnership when I expected only transaction, love when I expected only safety. I promise to stand with you through whatever comes. I promise to see you as you are, not what you were or what you fear becoming, but the good man you've proven yourself to be. I promise to build a home with you, not just a house, and to fill it with the life and love we both deserve. They exchanged rings, simple gold bands that caught the light like promises made solid. When Pastor Henriksen pronounced them married, Elias kissed Clara with such tenderness that several women in the congregation dabbed their eyes. The celebration that followed was joyful and generous, the community embracing them as fully as 2 people who'd fought for Covenant's safety. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, stories shared, and friendships forged. Clara watched Elias gradually relax, watched him smile, and even laugh as Samuel told an outrageous story about their shared experience in the hotel battle. As the sun set and the celebration continued by lamplight, Elias pulled Clara aside for a private moment in the churchyard. Thank you, he said simply. For what? For not giving up on me. For seeing something worth fighting for when everyone else saw only what I'd been. He held both her hands. For making me believe I could have this. A home, a wife, a life that doesn't involve running. You gave me the same gift, Clara said. A future instead of just survival, partnership instead of loneliness, love instead of merely existing. They stood together under the stars, two people who'd found each other through circumstance and chosen each other through courage, and Clara felt the last pieces of fear and doubt fall away. This was home. This man, this land, this life they were building together. Winter came in earnest 2 weeks after the wedding, blanketing the homestead in heavy snow that isolated them from town for days at a time. But the isolation felt different now, not lonely, but intimate, a cocoon of warmth and companionship, while the world outside froze. Elias proved to be good company during the long, dark evenings. He read aloud from the books Clara had inherited from her father, his rough voice gentling around poetry and prose. She taught him to cook beyond simple trail food, laughing as he cursed over complicated recipes. They played cards, talked for hours, made love in front of the fire while snow piled against the windows. One evening, as they sat together, Clara working on mending while Elias carved a piece of wood into something that might become a bird, she voiced a thought that had been growing in her mind for weeks. "I've been thinking about next spring," she said, "about expanding the homestead, maybe adding chickens for sale or planting more garden than we need so we can trade in town." Elias looked up from his carving. "You want to turn this into a real operation?" "I want to turn it into something that matters, something that grows instead of just surviving." Clara set down her sewing. "My father dreamed of building something lasting here. I think we could actually do it." "We could." Elias's eyes brightened with interest. "I've been thinking about breeding horses. There's good grazing in the North Pasture, and the territory needs quality stock. Could be profitable." They spent the next hour planning, ideas building on ideas, their shared vision taking shape. The homestead wouldn't just be a refuge anymore. It would be a legacy, something they built together and could pass on someday. "We'll need help eventually," Clara said. "Maybe hire hands in the busy seasons. And more buildings, a proper stable, maybe a bunkhouse." Elias smiled. "We're talking about building an empire here, Mrs. Crow." "Not an empire. A home that sustains itself and helps sustain others." Clara moved to sit beside him. "Something good, Elias. Something that proves violence doesn't have to define us." He set down his carving and pulled her close. "I like that. Building something good with you." As winter deepened, they settled into the work of making their vision real. Elias drew up plans for spring construction, while Clara researched crops and livestock management. They wrote letters to agricultural offices, consulted with Samuel about metalwork needs, even reached out to Thomas Merritt's family in Philadelphia to let them know his final wish had been honored. The response from Thomas's sister was both heartbreaking and healing. She thanked them for keeping her brother's promise, for giving meaning to his final days, and sent them a box of his belongings, including the journal where he'd written about Clara, about his hopes for their future together. Clara read the journal entries with tears streaming down her face while Elias held her. "He would have been good to you," Elias said quietly. "Better than me in so many ways." "Different than you," Clara corrected. "Not better, just different." She closed the journal and looked at her husband. "Thomas gave me hope when I had none. You gave me strength to claim the future that hope promised. I needed both of you, each in your own way." They kept Thomas's journal on the mantel alongside their wedding photograph, a reminder of the man whose death had brought them together and whose final act of friendship had saved them both. Spring came slowly, the snow melting to reveal ground ready for planting. True to their plans, Claire and Elias began expanding. They hired 2 young men from town to help with construction and heavy labor. Samuel built them equipment at cost, investing in their success. Pastor Henriksen connected them with farmers willing to share knowledge and seeds. The homestead transformed week by week. New fences went up, straight and strong. A stable took shape near the barn. Clara's garden expanded into something approaching a small farm, neat rows waiting for seed. Elias broke and trained 2 young horses, his patience and skill earning him a reputation that brought buyers from 3 counties over. By summer, they were thriving instead of merely surviving. The work was hard and endless, but it was theirs, built by their hands, sustained by their partnership, proof that something good could grow from desperate beginnings. One evening in late July, Clara stood on the porch watching the sun set over land that had never looked more beautiful. Elias came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. "Tired?" he asked. "Exhausted, but happy." She leaned back against him. "Are you happy, Elias?" "More than I ever thought possible." He turned her to face him. "You know what Thomas wrote in that journal? He said he hoped you'd find someone who could love you the way you deserve to be loved. Completely, fiercely, without reservation. I think about that sometimes. About how he sent me here to protect you, but maybe he knew something I didn't." "What's that?" "That I needed you just as much as you needed me. That we'd save each other." Elias brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I love you, Clara Crow. I love the life we're building. I love waking up beside you and falling asleep knowing you're safe. I love who I am when I'm with you." Clara's throat tightened with emotion. "I love you too. All of you, the darkness and the light, the past and the future, everything you are and everything you're becoming." They kissed as the sun disappeared below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Around them, their homestead settled into evening quiet, horses moving in the stable, chickens roosting, the satisfied stillness of land well tended and crops growing strong. This was what they'd fought for, what they'd risked everything to claim. Not just survival, but a life worth living. Not just safety, but home. Clara had ordered a husband through desperate necessity, expecting a gentle schoolteacher who would provide legal protection and polite distance. Instead, she'd received an armed stranger haunted by violence and grief. A man who'd arrived at her door like death's messenger. But that stranger had become her partner, her love, her choice. Elias Crow was not what Clara Whitmore had ordered. He was so much more, braver, stronger, more wounded, and more whole than any advertisement could promise. He'd taught her to fight, to stand, to believe she was worth fighting for. He'd given her a future when she'd had only a past. And she'd given him something equally precious, a reason to stop running, a home to belong to, a love that saw past his scars to the honorable man beneath. Together, they'd built something neither could have created alone, a homestead that thrived, a partnership rooted in respect and tested by fire, a love that grew stronger with every shared sunrise. As stars began appearing in the darkening sky, Clara and Elias walked inside their home. Bullet holes patched, damage repaired, every scar a testament to survival. They'd faced violence and emerged not broken, but forged into something unbreakable. The gunman's bride had found her happily ever after, not in spite of the darkness they'd survived, but because of it. And every morning when she woke in Elias's arms, Clara gave silent thanks for the twist of fate that had sent her exactly the wrong man, who turned out to be exactly right.